The November rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Thompson's corner office, 30 floors above downtown Chicago. He stood with his back to his mahogany desk, watching the city blur through sheets of water, his reflection a dark silhouette against the storm. At 45, Marcus had built an empire from nothing. Thompson's fine dining now boasted 12 locations across 6 states, each one a testament to his relentless drive and business acumen. His phone buzzed with another notification, another negative review for his flagship restaurant downstairs. Overpriced and underwhelming, one customer wrote. The salmon was dry and the service was pretentious. Marcus's jaw tightened as he scrolled through similar complaints from the past month. Mr. Thompson? Sarah Chen, his assistant, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 5 years of keeping his chaotic schedule manageable. Chef Rodriguez just submitted his resignation, effective immediately. Marcus turned from the window, his expensive suit impeccable, despite the weight of frustration pulling at his shoulders. That's the 3rd head chef this year, Sarah. What's his excuse? Creative differences with management, he says. But the kitchen staff mentioned he's been drinking during shifts. Sarah's voice carried the diplomatic tone she'd perfected when delivering bad news. Marcus sank into his leather chair, running a hand over his close-cropped beard. His restaurants had always been his pride, but lately they felt more like a burden. Success had brought money, more than he'd ever dreamed of growing up in Detroit's Corktown, but it had also brought distance from the passion that started it all. When was the last time he'd actually cooked something with his own hands? "Cancel my dinner with the investors," he said, loosening his tie. "I'm going downstairs to see what kind of mess we're dealing with." The elevator descended to the restaurant level, each floor marking Marcus's transition from businessman back to restaurateur. The lunch rush was winding down when he emerged into Thompson's main dining room. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths and burgundy leather banquettes. Servers moved with practiced efficiency between tables filled with Chicago's business elite. "Mr. Thompson," James Mitchell, the restaurant manager, hurried over, his face flushed with stress. "I didn't know you were coming down. We're handling the chef situation." "Where's the kitchen?" Marcus asked, already walking toward the stainless steel doors. The kitchen was chaos. Without Rodriguez's leadership, the line cooks moved like scattered soldiers without a general. Orders backed up on the pass, servers tapped their feet impatiently, and the temperature seemed to have risen 10 degrees from the stress alone. Marcus grabbed an apron from a hook, ignoring the surprised stares from the staff. "Who's been calling the shots since Rodriguez left?" "Nobody, really," admitted Tony, the sous chef, a thin man in his 30s whose hands shook slightly. Whether from nerves or something else, Marcus couldn't tell. "We're just trying to keep up with orders." From the dish pit in the back corner, Marcus heard the steady rhythm of plates being washed, scraped, and stacked. At least someone was keeping pace with the madness. He'd barely noticed the dishwasher in his previous visits, a tall, lean black man who kept his head down and worked with quiet efficiency. "What about the evening menu?" Marcus asked, scanning the prep station. Half the mise en place looked sloppy, vegetables unevenly cut, sauces that had separated from sitting too long. "We're using Rodriguez's prep from yesterday," Tony admitted, "but we're already running low on some items." Marcus felt the familiar fire building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him from washing dishes himself 20 years ago to building an empire. But this time the anger was mixed with something else, disappointment in himself for letting things get this bad. As he surveyed his struggling kingdom, the steady sound of dishwashing continued from the back corner, a metronome of reliability in the midst of chaos. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the most important people were the ones you never really saw. David Karanja's hands moved with practiced precision through the sudsy water, each plate scrubbed clean in seconds before moving to the rinse cycle. The dinner rush was building, and dirty dishes poured in from the dining room in endless waves. Steam rose around him in the cramped dish pit, making his uniform stick to his lean frame, but he maintained his rhythm. Wash, rinse, stack, repeat. At 28, David had learned to find meditation in the monotony. Each plate was a small victory, each clean glass a moment of order in chaos. The other kitchen staff barely acknowledged his presence, which suited him fine. Invisible was safe. Invisible paid the bills. His phone, tucked safely in his locker, contained photos of a different life. Diploma from Le Cordon Bleu, Nairobi. pictures of elaborate dishes he'd created during his training, awards from culinary competitions. But that was a world away, literally and figuratively. Here he was just another immigrant working the jobs Americans didn't want. "David!" Tony's voice cut through the kitchen noise. The sous chef looked frazzled, his usually neat appearance disheveled from the stress of covering for the departed head chef. "We need more clean plates on the line now." David nodded, pushing a cart loaded with spotless dinner plates toward the kitchen line. As he moved through the cramped space, he couldn't help but notice the chaos around him. The grill station was running behind, steaks overcooked on one side, while the sauté pans sat empty. The salad station had run out of their signature vinaigrette, servers making apologetic excuses to tables. He'd watched this kitchen struggle for months, biting his tongue as he saw waste and inefficiency that could be easily fixed. But speaking up meant attention, and attention led to questions about his status, his qualifications, his right to be there at all. "Behind you," called Maria, one of the line cooks, carrying a pan of burned vegetables to the trash. David stepped aside, noting how the vegetables had been cut unevenly, some pieces charred while others remained raw. In culinary school, his instructor would have made him start over 3 times for such sloppy knife work. The ticket printer at the pass chattered constantly, orders backing up faster than the depleted kitchen staff could handle. David caught glimpses of the orders as he moved past. Table 12, medium rare ribeye, roasted vegetables, red wine reduction. Table 8, pan-seared salmon risotto, seasonal vegetables. Simple dishes, but ones that required technique and timing, this kitchen currently lacked. "Where's the salmon for table 8? James, the floor manager, appeared at the pass, his usual calm cracking under pressure. 6 more minutes, Tony called back, but David could see the salmon in the pan was already overcooked, the edges beginning to curl. As David returned to his dish station, he passed the walk-in cooler and noticed the door slightly ajar, a waste of energy and money that made him wince. Inside, he glimpsed containers of prep that were improperly stored, vegetables that would spoil within days instead of lasting the week. His hands returned to the familiar rhythm of washing, but his mind wandered to the kitchen he'd run briefly in Nairobi before the restaurant closed due to economic pressures. 40 seats, a staff of 8, and cuisine that blended traditional Kenyan flavors with French technique. Food and Wine magazine had called it a revelation in their single review before everything fell apart. David, this time it was Marcus Thompson himself, the owner, standing at the edge of the dish pit in an expensive suit with an apron tied around his waist. David had seen him from a distance before, but never up close. The man looked tired, frustrated, older than his years. "Yes, sir?" David kept his voice neutral, respectful. "How long have you been working here?" 8 months, sir." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the overflowing dish racks. "You're the most reliable person in this kitchen. Dishes are always clean, always on time." "Thank you, sir." There was something in Marcus's tone that made David look up from the soap suds. The owner was studying him with curious eyes, as if seeing him for the first time despite months of working in the same space. "What's your background, David, before this?" The question hung in the steamy air between them. David's hands paused in the wash water. This was the moment he'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure, the chance to be seen, really seen, balanced against the risk of exposure. "I worked in restaurants in Kenya, sir. Different positions." It was true, technically. He'd worked as a dishwasher, prep cook, line cook, and eventually head chef, but Marcus didn't need to know the progression. Marcus looked around the struggling kitchen, then back at David. "Ever think about doing more than washing dishes?" David's heart hammered against his ribs. "I'm grateful for this job, sir. I do my best." "I'm sure you do." Marcus started to turn away, then stopped. "David?" "Yes, sir?" "If you ever have ideas about how to improve things around here, I'm listening. This kitchen needs all the help it can get." As Marcus walked away, David returned to his dishes with trembling hands. For 8 months he'd remained invisible, safe in his corner of the kitchen, but something had just shifted. A door had cracked open, and David wasn't sure whether to step through it or push it firmly closed. 3 days after Marcus's conversation with David, the kitchen reached its breaking point. The evening rush on Friday night brought a full house, every table in Thompson's dining room occupied by Chicago's elite, expecting the caliber of food that justified the premium prices. Marcus stood at the pass, Having abandoned his office entirely to oversee the disaster unfolding before him, Tony was sweating through his chef's coat, shouting contradictory orders to a line staff that looked ready to walk out. The ticket printer hadn't stopped chattering in 2 hours, and the complaints from the dining room were mounting. "Where's the Wellington for table 6? James appeared at Marcus's shoulder, his usual diplomatic composure cracking. "They've been waiting 45 minutes. "Wellington's burned," Tony called back without looking up from the grill. "Starting over." Marcus's jaw clenched. Beef Wellington was a $65 dish, and they'd already wasted 2 portions tonight. The food cost was spiraling out of control, but more importantly, his reputation was dissolving with each disappointed customer. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. "Channel 7 just called. They want a comment about the review in tomorrow's Tribune." Marcus didn't need to ask what the review said. Food critics didn't call restaurants for comment when they were about to praise them. 20 years of building his reputation, and it was crumbling in real time. A crash of plates from the dish pit cut through the kitchen noise. Marcus turned to see David quickly cleaning up what looked like an entire bus tub of glassware, water spreading across the floor. But instead of the frustrated curse he expected, David was already mopping, his movements efficient and calm despite the chaos around him. "Fire 2 ribeyes, medium rare," Tony shouted. "And where's my risotto?" "Risotto's broken," called back Luis from the sauté station. "Cheese seized up." Marcus watched David's head snap up at those words, his hands pausing in their cleaning motion. For just a moment, the dishwasher's face showed something Marcus hadn't seen before, not confusion, but recognition. As if David knew exactly what had gone wrong and how to fix it. "Start another risotto," Tony ordered, "and this time, don't rush it." "We don't have time to start over," Luis protested. "Table 12's been waiting 30 minutes already." The kitchen was falling apart, and Marcus felt powerless to stop it. He'd built this empire through determination and business acumen, but standing here in the middle of culinary chaos, he realized how far removed he'd become from the actual craft of cooking. "Everybody stop." The voice that cut through the noise wasn't Tony's or Marcus's. It was David's, speaking louder than anyone had ever heard him before. The entire kitchen turned to stare at the dishwasher, who'd never said more than "yes, sir" in 8 months of employment. David looked as surprised as anyone that he'd spoken, but he stepped away from his dish station, wiping his hands on his apron. The risotto. You can save it." Tony's face flushed red. "Get back to your dishes, man. We don't need—" "How?" Marcus interrupted, his eyes fixed on David. Something in the young man's posture had changed, shoulders straight, confidence replacing the usual hunched submission. David hesitated, glancing around at the hostile faces of the kitchen staff. "The cheese seized because the heat was too high when it was added. If you add a little hot stock slowly, whisk it constantly, you can bring it back together. The proteins will relax." The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Luis, desperate enough to try anything, reached for the ruined risotto. "Show me." David moved to the sauté station with the fluid grace of someone who belonged there. His hands took the pan, and Marcus watched as the dishwasher's entire demeanor transformed. The nervous deference disappeared, replaced by focused competence. "Low heat," David said, adjusting the flame. "Add the stock 1 spoon at a time, keep whisking." His movements were precise, confident, the hands of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. Within 2 minutes, the broken risotto had transformed into silky perfection. David tasted it with a clean spoon, added a pinch of salt and a grind of black pepper, then stepped back. Luis stared at the restored dish. Tony's mouth hung open. Even the line cooks had stopped their frantic cooking to watch. "Where did you learn to do that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the hood fans. David's confidence flickered, uncertainty returning to his eyes. I picked things up over the years, sir, working in different kitchens." But Marcus wasn't buying the humble deflection anymore. The way David had moved, the technique he'd displayed, that wasn't something you picked up. That was formal training, serious experience. "David," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority that had built an empire, "I need you to be straight with me. What's your real background?" The kitchen had gone silent except for the sizzle of pans and the distant chatter of the dining room. David looked around at the faces staring at him, suspicious, curious, some openly hostile. 8 months of invisibility had just shattered in 2 minutes of competence. "I studied at culinary school in Nairobi," David said quietly. "Le cordon bleu." I worked as a chef for 3 years before coming to America. The revelation hit the kitchen like a bomb. Tony's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been embarrassment. The line cooks exchanged glances, suddenly seeing their quiet dishwasher in an entirely new light. "Why are you washing dishes if you're a trained chef?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. David's shoulders sagged slightly. Visa restrictions, no American culinary credentials. Nobody would hire a Kenyan chef when there are American culinary school graduates available. Marcus looked around his failing kitchen, then back at David, the man who'd been the solution to his problems for 8 months hidden in plain sight. The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. Sasi Duasand at the dining room had finally emptied, the last disappointed customers departing into the Chicago night. Marcus sat alone at the bar, a glass of bourbon untouched in front of him, while the kitchen staff finished their closing duties. Through the service window, he could see David back at his dish station, working through the mountain of plates and glassware from the disastrous evening. The conversation with David had ended abruptly when the next wave of orders came in, forcing everyone back to their stations. But Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed, the transformation from invisible dishwasher to confident chef in the span of 2 minutes. Sarah appeared beside him, tablet in hand. "The damage report from tonight? 12 complaints called in, 4 walkouts, and the food cost hit 38% with all the remakes." She paused. "And the Tribune review goes live online at midnight." Marcus checked his watch. 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes until his reputation took another public beating. "Send everyone home except the dishwasher. I want to talk to him." "Sir?" "You heard me." 20 minutes later, the kitchen was empty except for Marcus and David. The young man stood uncertainly by his now spotless dish station, still wearing his wet apron, clearly uncomfortable with the one-on-one attention. Marcus had changed out of his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Yes, sir." "If you were running this kitchen, what would you do differently?" David's eyes darted around the empty space as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Mr. Thompson, I don't want to speak badly about—" "The kitchen is broken," Marcus interrupted. "We both know it. I'm not asking you to throw anyone under the bus. I'm asking for your professional opinion." Something in Marcus's tone seemed to reach David. The young man's posture straightened slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried more conviction. "The menu is too large," David said. 28 entrees means the kitchen can't maintain consistency. Half the staff doesn't know how to properly execute the dishes they're responsible for." He paused, gauging Marcus's reaction before continuing. "The inventory system is inefficient. I see waste every day that costs thousands of dollars." Marcus nodded. "What else?" "The flow is wrong. The grill station is too close to the salad prep, so the heat affects the greens. The dish pit should be repositioned to improve the cycle of clean plates to the line." David was warming to the subject, his accent becoming more pronounced as his passion overcame his caution. "And the seasoning is inconsistent because different cooks are using different amounts without tasting." "You've been watching us," Marcus observed. "For 8 months, yes, sir. It's hard not to notice when you're in the middle of it." Marcus stood up from his bar stool and walked into the kitchen proper. David followed hesitantly. At the main prep station, Marcus pulled out a knife roll he kept in the office, tools he rarely used anymore but had never thrown away. "Show me," he said, placing the knives on the steel counter. "Sir? Cook something, anything. I want to see what a Le Cordon Bleu graduate can do with my ingredients." David stared at the knives, as if they were dangerous weapons. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not sure this is appropriate. The other staff are gone for the night. It's just you and me." Marcus leaned against the pass. "David, I've got a restaurant that's bleeding money and reputation. I've got staff who can't execute a basic risotto, and I just found out my dishwasher is a trained chef. This isn't about appropriateness anymore. This is about survival." The words hung in the air between them. David looked at the knives, then at Marcus, then around the kitchen that had been his prison for 8 months. Slowly, he reached for a chef's knife, testing its weight and balance with the familiarity of someone who'd spent years perfecting his technique. "What ingredients do you have?" David asked, and Marcus heard the change in his voice, the transformation from employee to chef beginning again. "Whatever's in the walk-in. Surprise me." David moved through the kitchen with newfound purpose, gathering ingredients with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was building. Marcus watched as the dishwasher disappeared completely, replaced by a professional who belonged in this space. Within minutes, David had assembled his mise en place: fresh salmon, wild mushrooms, fingerling potatoes, herbs and cream. His knife work was flawless. Perfectly uniform dice, precise julienne cuts, each movement economical and purposeful. Pan-seared salmon with wild mushroom risotto and herb oil, David announced, lighting burners with the comfortable authority of someone in his element. As David cooked, Marcus found himself mesmerized by the transformation. Every movement had purpose. Every technique was textbook perfect. The young man tasted constantly, adjusting seasoning with the confidence of someone who understood flavor profiles instinctively. The risotto came together like silk, each grain perfectly al dente. The salmon seared with a perfect golden crust while remaining tender inside. The herb oil was bright and aromatic, dotted around the plate with artistic precision. David stepped back from the finished plate, his confidence wavering as he returned to reality. "I hope it's acceptable, sir." Marcus picked up a fork and tasted the dish. The flavors were complex, balanced, sophisticated, better than anything his kitchen had produced in months. This wasn't just competent cooking. This was artistry disguised as a simple dish. "David," Marcus said, setting down his fork, "how would you like to stop washing dishes?" David's hands trembled slightly as he watched Marcus taste the dish, each second stretching like an eternity. 8 months of hiding, of keeping his head down and his skills buried, had led to this moment. Standing in an empty kitchen at midnight, waiting for judgment from a man who could change everything. Marcus took another bite, his expression unreadable. The silence was broken only by the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of Chicago traffic through the windows. When Marcus finally looked up, his eyes held something David hadn't seen before: respect. "This is restaurant-quality food," Marcus said simply. "Better than restaurant quality. This is the kind of dish that builds reputations." David felt his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and fear. "Thank you, sir." "Stop calling me sir." Marcus set down his fork and leaned against the prep counter. "We need to talk chef to chef. My name is Marcus." The word chef hit David like a physical blow. He hadn't heard himself called that in over a year, hadn't allowed himself to think of himself in those terms since arriving in America. In the dish pit, he was just David, invisible, safe, unremarkable. But standing here with his knife roll spread across the counter and the aroma of his cooking filling the air, he remembered who he used to be. "Marcus," David said carefully, testing the informal address. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus walked to the office and returned with 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon. He poured 2 fingers into each glass, sliding one across the steel surface to David. "I'm proposing we save this restaurant. Together." David stared at the amber liquid. "I don't understand." "My head chef walked out. My kitchen staff can't execute basic dishes. My food costs are through the roof, and my reputation is circling the drain." Marcus raised his glass. "You've been watching this disaster unfold for 8 months, and from what I just witnessed, you know exactly how to fix it. You want me to be your head chef." David's voice was barely above a whisper. "I want you to be my partner." Marcus's words hung in the air like a challenge. "Not just head chef, partner. You redesign the menu, retrain the staff, fix the operations. In return, you get a percentage of the profits and a path to legitimate employment status." David's mind reeled. 8 months ago, he'd walked into this building desperate for any job that would pay rent and keep him fed. Now Marcus Thompson, millionaire restaurateur, was offering him partnership in a business worth more money than David had ever imagined. "Why?" David asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be..." "Could be what, a fraud?" Marcus shook his head. "David, I've been in this business for 20 years. I know talent when I see it. That dish you just cooked, that's not luck or beginner's fortune. That's skill, training, and passion combined with experience." David took a small sip of bourbon, the burn focusing his scattered thoughts. "The other staff won't accept me. Tony's been sous chef for 3 years. The line cooks barely acknowledge I exist. How can I suddenly become their boss?" "That's the beauty of it," Marcus said. "They don't have to like it. They just have to do their jobs or find new ones. This kitchen is broken, David. Completely broken. I can hire new staff easier than I can fix the current ones' bad habits." The weight of the opportunity pressed down on David's shoulders. Everything he'd dreamed of since arriving in America was being offered to him on a silver platter, but the risks were enormous. Success would mean exposure, attention, The possibility that his visa status could be questioned. Failure would mean losing not just this job, but potentially any chance of staying in the country. "I need to think about this," David said. "Think fast." Marcus drained his bourbon glass. "I've got investors breathing down my neck and the Tribune review goes live in—" He checked his watch. 6 minutes. "I need to show dramatic improvement within 2 weeks, or I'm looking at closing this location." The reality of the timeline hit David like cold water. 2 weeks to transform a failing kitchen, retrain a hostile staff, and prove himself worthy of Marcus's faith. It seemed impossible. "What about my legal status?" David asked. "I'm here on a tourist visa that I've extended beyond its original terms." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "I have lawyers who specialize in employment immigration. If you can demonstrate exceptional ability in your field, which you just did, there are paths to legitimate work authorization. It won't be immediate, but it's possible." David thought of his small apartment in Rogers Park, the cramped studio he shared with 2 other immigrants. He thought of the culinary school diploma gathering dust in his closet, the dreams he'd packed away with his chef's knives. He thought of his mother in Nairobi, who still bragged to her friends about her son the chef, not knowing he spent his days elbow deep in dirty dishes. "If I say yes," David said slowly, "what happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow you come in as head chef. We sit down with the current staff and explain the new hierarchy. Anyone who has a problem with it can clear out their locker." Marcus's voice carried the steel that had built his empire. "You'll have complete control over the menu, the ordering, the kitchen operations. I'll handle the business side and give you whatever support you need." David looked around the kitchen, his kingdom for 8 months, the place where he'd hidden his dreams and talents. The prep stations where he'd watched waste and inefficiency cost thousands of dollars. The pass where he'd seen dish after dish leave improperly prepared. The dish pit where he'd spent countless hours imagining how he would run things differently. "The menu needs to be completely redesigned," David said, his voice growing stronger. "Smaller, focused, emphasizing technique over variety. The staff needs retraining from the ground up. The inventory system needs a complete overhaul." Marcus smiled for the first time all evening. "Is that a yes?" David picked up the chef's knife he'd used to prepare the salmon, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. For 8 months, the only tools he'd held were dish brushes and spray nozzles. The knife felt like coming home. "Yes," David said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "Complete autonomy in the kitchen, no interference with my hiring and firing decisions, and if any of the current staff can't adapt to the new standards, they go, no matter how long they've been here." Marcus extended his hand across the prep counter. "Deal." As they shook hands, David felt the weight of 8 months of invisibility lifting from his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would walk into this kitchen not as a dishwasher hiding his talents, but as Chef David Karanja, ready to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places. The Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with Lake Michigan winds whipping through downtown Chicago's concrete canyons. David stood outside Thompson's restaurant at 7 a.m., wearing his only good pair of pants and a white button-down shirt he'd bought for job interviews that never materialized. In his hand, he carried a worn leather knife roll, his most precious possession, finally coming out of hiding. His reflection in the restaurant's windows showed a different man than the one who'd left the building 12 hours earlier. Gone was the hunched posture of the invisible dishwasher, replaced by the straight-backed confidence of someone who belonged in professional kitchens. But beneath the confidence, his stomach churned with nerves. Marcus arrived at 7:15, looking surprisingly well-rested for someone who'd been up past midnight, making life-changing decisions. He wore jeans and a casual shirt, the first time David had seen him in anything other than an expensive suit. "Ready for this?" Marcus asked, unlocking the front door. "No," David answered honestly, "but that's never stopped me before." They entered the restaurant together, their footsteps echoing in the empty dining room. The kitchen felt different in the morning light, less chaotic, full of potential rather than problems. David walked straight to his former dish station and began untying the apron he'd worn for 8 months. "Symbolic?" Marcus asked. "Necessary." David folded the apron and placed it on the clean counter. "I can't lead from the dish pit." At 9 a.m., the first staff members began arriving for the lunch prep shift. Tony entered through the back door, his usual swagger intact, completely unaware that his world was about to change. Luis and Maria followed, along with two other line cooks whose names David had never learned, despite working beside them for months. The prep cooks did double takes when they saw David standing at the main prep station rather than hidden in his corner. Tony frowned, clearly annoyed by this breach of kitchen hierarchy. "What's the dishwasher doing at the prep station?" Tony asked Marcus, his tone carrying 8 months of casual dismissal. "David isn't the dishwasher anymore," Marcus replied calmly. "As of today, he's your head chef." The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of refrigeration units. 5 faces stared at Marcus, as if he'd announced that gravity was now optional. Tony's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally anger. "This is a joke, right?" Tony's voice pitched higher. "You're making the dishwasher head chef? The guy who doesn't even speak English half the time?" David felt the familiar flush of anger at the casual racism, but he kept his voice level. "I speak English perfectly, Tony. I also speak Swahili, French, and enough Spanish to understand when you've been talking about me for the past 8 months. The revelation that David had understood their conversations added another layer of shock to the already stunned kitchen staff. Maria actually took a step backward, her face flushing as she remembered some of the comments she'd made in Spanish. "This is insane," Tony continued, appealing directly to Marcus. "I've been sous chef here for 3 years. I know this kitchen inside and out. You can't just promote some random dishwasher over me." "David isn't random," Marcus said. "He's a graduate of Le Cordon Bleu with 3 years of head chef experience. He's been watching this kitchen fail for 8 months while you've been running it into the ground." The words hit Tony like physical blows. His face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. "You're telling me this guy has been playing dishwasher while he's actually some hotshot chef? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "Show them," Marcus said quietly to David. David had prepared for this moment, knowing that words alone wouldn't establish his authority. He moved to the knife rack and selected a 10-inch chef's knife, then pulled a bag of onions from the walk-in cooler. His movements were deliberate, confident, the body language of someone completely at home with dangerous tools and high-pressure situations. The first onion fell under his knife with machine-like precision, perfect brunoise cuts, each piece exactly the same size. His blade work was hypnotically fast, each cut creating a rhythmic percussion against the cutting board. Within 60 seconds, he'd reduced 5 onions to perfectly uniform dice without a single tear in his eyes or a moment's hesitation in his technique. "Jesus," whispered one of the line cooks David had never spoken to. David moved to the sauté station and heated a pan with the fluid economy of motion that marked professional cooks. He added oil, then the diced onions, adjusting the heat without looking at the controls, muscle memory from thousands of hours in professional kitchens guiding his movements. "Basic mirepoix," David announced, adding celery and carrots with the same perfect knife work. "Foundation of classical French cooking, the base for stocks, sauces, braises, and soups." He looked directly at Tony. "How many times have you made this properly in the past month?" Tony's mouth opened and closed without sound. The mirepoix in David's pan was already turning golden, the vegetables sweating properly without browning, a technique that required precise heat control and timing. "The menu is changing," David continued, his voice carrying new authority. "Immediately. We're cutting from 28 entrees to 12. Every dish will be executed properly or not at all. Anyone who can't adapt to professional standards can clear out their locker." Louis stepped forward, his face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" David moved to the prep station where Marcus had laid out printed copies of a new menu, something he'd worked on until 3 a.m., combining his culinary school training with 8 months of observing this kitchen's capabilities and limitations. "Simplified but sophisticated," David explained, distributing the menus. "Pan-seared proteins with classical preparations, fresh vegetables prepared properly, sauces made from scratch, not from powder bases." He paused, looking around the circle of faces. "Real cooking." Tony snatched one of the menus, his eyes scanning the dishes with growing agitation. "Half of these require techniques we've never used here. That sauce alone takes 3 days to prepare properly." "Then we start preparing it 3 days in advance," David replied. "Professional kitchens work on cycles, not panic. We prep ahead, we mise en place properly, and we execute consistently." The transformation was remarkable to watch. David's accent, barely noticeable when he was trying to remain invisible, now carried the confidence of someone who belonged in charge. His posture, his hand movements, even the way he held his head, everything screamed professional chef. "I have one question," Tony said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If you're such a hotshot chef, why were you washing our dishes for 8 months? David met his gaze steadily. "Because sometimes you have to survive before you can succeed, and sometimes the most important lessons come from watching other people fail." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Tony looked around at his fellow cooks, seeking support, but found only uncertainty and growing acceptance of the new reality. Marcus stepped forward. "Anyone who wants to stay and learn from Chef Karanja is welcome. Anyone who can't accept the new hierarchy should speak up now." The silence stretched for 30 seconds. Then Tony untied his apron and threw it on the prep counter. "This is bullshit," he said, heading for his locker. "You'll regret this decision." As Tony's footsteps echoed toward the exit, David felt both relief and trepidation. The revolution had begun, but now he had to prove he could actually lead it. The lunch service on David's first day as head chef began like a controlled avalanche, manageable at first, then accelerating beyond anyone's comfort zone. With Tony gone and the remaining staff still adjusting to the new hierarchy, the kitchen operated with the tentative precision of people learning to trust both their new leader and themselves. David stood at the pass, calling out orders with calm authority that masked the storm of anxiety in his chest. The new menu had been streamlined to 8 lunch items, each one designed to showcase proper technique, while remaining within the reduced staff's capabilities. But theory and practice, he was learning, were 2 very different animals. "Fire 2 salmon, 1 medium rare," David called. "And I need that risotto in 3 minutes, not 5. Luis nodded from the sauté station, his movements more focused than David had seen in months. The departure of Tony seemed to have lifted a weight from the entire kitchen, the toxic energy of someone who'd been phoning it in for months, replaced by nervous but genuine effort. Maria worked the salad station with renewed attention to detail, her knife cuts improving with each plate. The 2 remaining line cooks, James and Carlos, rotated between prep duties and backing up the main stations. It wasn't the smooth operation David ultimately envisioned, but it was functional, a vast improvement from the chaos of the previous evening. "Behind you, chef," James called, carrying a tray of prepped vegetables to the walk-in. The use of chef still sent a small thrill through David's chest. 8 months of "Hey You" and "Dishwasher" had trained him not to expect respect, but here it was, offered freely by people who'd seen him prove himself. The first real test came at 12:30 p.m., when the restaurant filled with its usual lunch crowd, downtown business executives expecting precision and speed. David watched the ticket printer with the focused intensity of a general monitoring battlefield communications. Each order represented a chance to prove that the new system worked, or to confirm every doubt Tony had voiced that morning. "Order up," David called, sliding 2 plates across the pass. "Table 12, salmon and the pork tenderloin." The server, Jennifer, paused to inspect the plates before taking them to the dining room. David held his breath, watching her face for any sign of dissatisfaction. The presentation was clean, professional, restaurant quality in a way this kitchen hadn't achieved in months. "Beautiful plates, chef," Jennifer said, and David felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. But success bred its own problems. Word seemed to spread through the dining room that something had changed in the kitchen. Orders came faster, expectations rose, and the margin for error shrank with each successful plate that left the pass. "We're running low on the duck breast," Luis called from his station. "Maybe enough for 3 more orders." David mentally calculated the remaining lunch service time against their prep levels. This was the kind of inventory management that separated professional kitchens from amateur operations, the ability to project demand and adjust accordingly without running out of signature items. 86 the duck after the next 2 orders, David announced. "If anyone asks, recommend the pork tenderloin, same price point, similar flavor profile." It was a small decision, but it demonstrated the kind of forward thinking that had been missing from this kitchen. David caught Marcus watching from the service window, approval evident in his expression. The real crisis came at 1:15 p.m. during the peak of lunch rush. A ticket printed for a table of 6 business executives, a mix of salmon, steaks, and pasta that would test every station simultaneously. David looked at his reduced staff and felt the familiar flutter of panic that every chef knew but learned to master. "Big ticket coming up," he announced. 6 top, VIP treatment. Luis, I need perfect risotto, creamy but not loose. Maria, your salads need to be magazine-worthy. James, those steaks better have perfect grill marks and accurate temperatures. The kitchen moved with the synchronized intensity of a surgical team. David found himself everywhere at once, tasting sauces, adjusting seasoning, ensuring proper plating techniques. This was what he'd missed most during his months in the dish pit. The conductor's role, orchestrating multiple elements into a harmonious whole. How's that risotto coming? David asked, watching Luis work the pan with growing confidence. 2 minutes, chef. It's looking good. Steaks are resting, James called from the grill. Medium rare and medium, perfect temp. David assembled the plates with the artistic precision that had impressed his instructors in culinary school. Each element had its place, colors balanced, sauces dotted with intention rather than splashed with haste. When the 6 plates stood completed on the pass, they looked like they belonged in a cookbook rather than emerging from a kitchen that had been in chaos 24 hours earlier. Order up, table 14, party of 6. The servers approached with something approaching reverence. These weren't the hastily assembled, inconsistent plates they'd grown accustomed to carrying. These were statements, declarations that Thompson's restaurant was serious about food again. Marcus appeared at David's shoulder as the plates disappeared into the dining room. How are you holding up? Good, David replied, though sweat beaded his forehead despite the kitchen's air conditioning. The staff is responding well. They want to do good work. They just needed leadership and clear standards. And the menu changes. Working. Simpler execution means better consistency. The food costs should drop significantly once we eliminate the waste from failed dishes. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. David, I need to tell you something. The Tribune review went live an hour ago. David's stomach clenched. He'd been so focused on the immediate challenges of service that he'd forgotten about the broader context, the review that could determine whether any of this mattered. How bad? David asked. Bad. 2 stars out of 4. Called the food uninspired and overpriced for the quality delivered. Marcus paused. But it was written before last night, before you took over. The weight of expectation settled on David's shoulders like a lead blanket. One devastating review could undo years of reputation building, and he had perhaps weeks to prove that the kitchen could deliver on a completely different level. We can fix this, David said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. Give me 2 weeks to train the staff properly and refine the menu, then invite the Tribune back for a re-review. That's a hell of a gamble, Marcus observed. Everything worth doing is a gamble. David looked around his kitchen now, with staff who were beginning to trust his leadership and a system that was actually functioning. But I'd rather fail attempting something great than succeed at mediocrity. As the lunch service wound down, David felt the exhaustion that came with intense focus and high stakes. But beneath the tiredness was something he hadn't experienced in months, satisfaction, the kind that came from using his skills properly, from leading people toward excellence rather than hiding his abilities in a corner. The transformation was far from complete, but for the first time since arriving in America, David felt like he was moving in the right direction, not just surviving, but building something worthy of his dreams. So the second week under David's leadership brought new challenges that tested both his culinary skills and his ability to manage people who were still adjusting to dramatic change. The lunch services had stabilized into something resembling professional operation, but dinner service remained the true test of a kitchen's capabilities. Higher expectations, more complex dishes, and the kind of scrutiny that could make or break reputations. David arrived early each morning, using the quiet hours before staff arrival to refine recipes and plan the day's prep schedule. The walk-in cooler, once a chaotic mess of improperly stored ingredients, now operated with military precision, everything labeled, dated, and organized according to the systematic approach he'd learned in culinary school. "Morning, chef," Luis called as he entered through the back door at 8 a.m. The sous chef position had fallen to him by default after Tony's departure, and he'd embraced the responsibility with surprising enthusiasm. His knife skills had improved dramatically in just 10 days, and his understanding of sauce techniques was approaching professional standards. "Morning, Luis. How did the stock turn out?" David had started a program of basic skill building, teaching techniques that should have been fundamental, but had been shortcuts or ignored entirely under the previous regime. Better than yesterday's batch. The color is deeper, and the gelatin content looks good. Luis pulled a container from the cooler, pride evident in his voice. Making proper stock from scratch was a time-intensive process that most restaurants had abandoned in favor of commercial bases, but David insisted on building flavors from the ground up. Maria arrived next, followed by James and Carlos. The morning prep routine had evolved into a smooth choreography, each person understanding their role in the larger operation. David had instituted a brief daily meeting where they discussed the day's specials, reviewed technique, and addressed any questions or concerns. "Today we're introducing the braised short ribs to the dinner menu," David announced, pulling a covered hotel pan from the oven. The aroma that escaped when he lifted the lid was rich, complex, the result of 12 hours of careful braising with proper mirepoix, fresh herbs, and the stock they'd been perfecting. The staff gathered around as David plated a test portion. The meat fell apart at the touch of a fork, the sauce glossy with natural gelatin, the vegetables perfectly tender. It was the kind of dish that required patience and technique rather than expensive ingredients. Comfort food elevated to restaurant quality. "This is what we're building toward," David explained as each team member tasted the dish. Techniques that create complex flavors through proper execution rather than trying to impress with exotic ingredients we can't afford. James nodded appreciatively. "This is better than anything we were putting out before. How do we make sure it stays consistent?" "Practice and systems," David replied. "Every sauce gets tasted before service, every protein gets temp-checked, every plate gets inspected before it leaves the pass. No shortcuts, no assumptions." The afternoon brought an unexpected challenge when Marcus appeared in the kitchen with two people David didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman in an expensive suit and a younger man carrying a notebook. "David, I'd like you to meet Janet Morrison from Chicago Food and Wine magazine and her photographer Steve." Marcus's tone was carefully neutral, but David caught the tension beneath his casual introduction. David's hands stilled on the knife he'd been using to brunoise shallots. Food writers were dangerous, capable of launching careers or destroying them with a few hundred words. The timing felt premature. He'd been in charge for barely 2 weeks. "Ms. Morrison, pleasure to meet you." David wiped his hands on his apron before extending one for a handshake. "To what do we owe the honor?" "I heard there have been some interesting changes at Thompson's," Janet replied, her eyes taking in the organized chaos of dinner prep. "New chef, new menu, new approach. Mind if I watch service tonight?" It wasn't really a question. Food writers went where they wanted, when they wanted, and restaurant owners rarely refused access. David glanced at Marcus, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Of course," David said. "Though I should mention we're still in a transition period. The menu is evolving as we refine our systems." "That's exactly what makes it interesting," Janet replied. "Mind if I ask about your background? It's unusual for a restaurant of this caliber to hire a chef without more established local credentials." The question David had been dreading since taking the position. His immigration status remained precarious, his American culinary credentials non-existent, but he'd learned that confidence, even when partially fabricated, was essential in professional kitchens. "I trained at Le Cordon Bleu in Nairobi and worked in several high-end establishments there before coming to Chicago," he said, sticking to verifiable facts. Sometimes fresh perspective comes from outside traditional career paths. "Nairobi," Janet repeated, making a note. "That's unusual. What brought you to Chicago specifically?" "Opportunity," David replied simply. "Mr. Thompson offered me the chance to build something new rather than simply maintain something existing." The dinner service began at 5:30 p.m., with Janet Morrison positioned at a corner table where she could observe both the dining room and the kitchen through the pass. David felt the weight of scrutiny like a physical presence, every movement more deliberate under the food writer's gaze. "First ticket," Luis called, reading from the printer. 2 salmon, 1 short rib, 1 pasta." David moved into conductor mode, orchestrating the timing so all 4 dishes would finish simultaneously. This was where his months of observation paid dividends. He knew exactly how long each element required, which station might fall behind, where problems typically developed. "Behind you, chef," Maria called, carrying plates to the pass. Her confidence had grown exponentially under David's encouragement, and her plating technique now showed genuine artistry. The plates that emerged from David's kitchen that evening were revelations compared to the food Thompson's had been serving weeks earlier. Colors vibrant, sauces properly emulsified, Proteins cooked to exact temperatures. Each dish looked like it belonged in the magazine Janet Morrison represented. "Order up," David called, sliding 4 plates across the pass with the fluid efficiency of someone completely in control of his domain. As the evening progressed, David noticed Janet occasionally making notes, her expression unreadable but attentive. The kitchen performed flawlessly. No remakes, no delays, no drama. Just professional execution of well-designed food. Near the end of service, Janet approached the pass. "Chef Karanja, would you mind plating your short rib dish for photography?" David's hands moved with practiced precision, building the plate like a painting. Sauce pooled artfully, vegetables arranged with intention, the meat positioned to show its perfect texture. When he finished, the dish looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. "Beautiful work," Janet said as Steve photographed the plate from multiple angles. "How long have you been developing this style?" "Years," David replied honestly. "But this particular expression of it, maybe 2 weeks." Janet smiled for the first time that evening. "Honesty, I appreciate that. Most chefs would claim they've been perfecting these dishes their entire careers." As the last customers departed and the staff began cleaning, David felt cautiously optimistic. The service had been flawless, the food impressive, and Janet Morrison seemed genuinely engaged rather than merely polite. "Not bad for someone who was washing dishes 3 weeks ago," Marcus said quietly as they watched Janet and Steve leave. "It's just the beginning," David replied, "but it's a good beginning." 3 weeks after Janet Morrison's visit, David had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable for the first time since taking over the kitchen. The dinner services ran with clockwork precision. The staff had embraced the new standards, and the food costs had dropped by 15%, while quality had improved dramatically. But success in the restaurant business was measured not just in smooth operations, but in public recognition, and that remained frustratingly elusive. The morning routine had become David's favorite part of each day. Arriving at 7 a.m. to an empty kitchen, he could work in peaceful silence, tasting yesterday's stocks, adjusting recipes, and planning the evening's specials. The walk-in cooler now hummed with properly aging meats, fermenting vegetables, and sauces that developed complexity over days, rather than being rushed together in minutes. "Chef, we've got a problem," Luis announced, as he burst through the back door, his usual morning calm replaced by obvious agitation. David looked up from the sauce he'd been reducing for the evening's duck special. "What kind of problem?" "The Tribune called. They want to do a follow-up review tonight. Apparently someone tipped them off that the kitchen had changed significantly since their last visit." David's stomach clenched. The Tribune's brutal 2-star review still haunted Thompson's reputation, and while he'd been planning to invite them back eventually, he'd hoped for more time to perfect their systems. "So who's the reviewer?" David asked, already knowing the answer would determine the evening's stress level. "Jonathan Hartwell." The name hit David like cold water. Hartwell was the Tribune's senior food critic, notorious for his exacting standards and devastating reviews of restaurants that failed to meet his expectations. He'd closed establishments with a few well-chosen paragraphs and launched others into the stratosphere with his rare positive reviews. Marcus appeared in the kitchen, his expression grim. "You heard? Just now, how much advance notice do we have? He'll be here at 8 tonight. Party of 4, so he's bringing backup opinions." Marcus leaned against the prep counter, running a hand through his hair. "David, I need to be straight with you. If this review goes badly, we're looking at closure. The investors are already nervous after the last review, and our reservation numbers are down 30%. The weight of responsibility settled on David's shoulders like a lead blanket. Not just his own future, but the jobs of everyone in the kitchen, the investment Marcus had made in giving him this chance, the reputation of the restaurant itself, all hanging on one evening's performance. "What's our strongest menu?" David asked, shifting immediately into crisis management mode. "The short ribs have been flawless every night this week," Luis offered. "And your salmon technique is getting raves from customers." "The duck special," Maria suggested. "The sauce you've been working on is incredible." David considered their options. The smart play would be to stick with dishes they'd perfected, items they could execute flawlessly under pressure. But Jonathan Hartwell had eaten at every significant restaurant in Chicago. He wasn't looking for competence. He was looking for inspiration. "We're going to do something special," David announced. "Our tasting menu, 5 courses, each one showcasing different techniques and ingredients. Nothing we haven't made before, but presented as a cohesive experience rather than individual dishes. The kitchen fell silent. Tasting menus required perfect timing, flawless execution, and the kind of coordination that even experienced teams struggled with. For a kitchen that had been rebuilt from scratch 3 weeks earlier, it was ambitious to the point of recklessness. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked. "We could play it safe, stick with what we know works." "Safe won't get us a good review," David replied. "Hartwell has eaten safe food at 100 restaurants this year. He needs to see that we're not just competent, we're exceptional." The afternoon transformed into intensive preparation unlike anything the kitchen had experienced. David designed each course to build upon the previous one, flavors complementing and contrasting in ways that would create a memorable dining experience. First course, house-cured salmon with pickled vegetables and herb oil, showcasing preservation techniques and knife skills. Second course, butternut squash soup with truffle foam, demonstrating classical French technique with modern presentation. Third course, the braised short ribs with root vegetable puree, comfort food elevated through proper technique and high-quality ingredients. Fourth course, duck breast with cherry gastrique and wild rice pilaf, protein cookery and sauce work at their finest. Fifth course, dark chocolate tart with salted caramel and coffee ice cream, pastry skills that would end the meal on a high note. "This is insane," Carlos muttered as he worked on brunoise cuts for the pickled vegetables. 5 courses for the most important critic in the city. "This is our shot," David corrected, "the chance to show what we're really capable of." By 6 p.m. the prep work was complete. Every sauce had been tasted and adjusted, every garnish prepared with surgical precision, every component of each dish ready for final assembly. The kitchen hummed with nervous energy, the staff moving with the focused intensity of soldiers preparing for battle. 30 minutes until service," David announced. "Everyone take 5 minutes to center yourselves, deep breaths. We've made every one of these dishes perfectly before. Tonight isn't about trying something new. It's about executing what we know at the highest possible level." At 7:45 p.m., Marcus appeared at the pass. "They're here. Table 12. Hartwell and 3 companions, including what looks like the Tribune's wine critic." David felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice steady. "How long until they order?" "They're looking at the menu now." I explained that we'd prepared a special tasting menu for the evening, and Hartwell seemed intrigued. "Okay, everyone," David called to his team. "This is it. Everything we've worked for comes down to the next 2 hours. Trust your training, trust each other, and trust the food. We've got this." The first course order came at 8:15 p.m. David watched through the pass as the server explained each dish to Hartwell's table, the critic's face maintaining the neutral expression that had intimidated Chicago's restaurant community for over a decade. "Fire 4 salmon appetizers," David called, his voice carrying the calm authority that had become his trademark. As the evening progressed, David orchestrated each course with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. The timing was flawless, each dish arriving at the optimal moment, the progression of flavors building exactly as he'd envisioned. Between courses, David caught glimpses of Hartwell's table through the pass. The critic was engaged, discussing each dish with his companions, taking notes. All positive signs, but impossible to interpret definitively. The final course left the kitchen at 10:30 p.m. David and his staff stood at the pass, watching as the chocolate tarts were presented to the table that would determine their future. Hartwell took his first bite, chewed thoughtfully, made a note. Then, for the first time all evening, Jonathan Hartwell smiled. And 6 months after David Karanja had transformed from invisible dishwasher to head chef, Thompson's restaurant hummed with the energy of the establishment that had found its identity. The Tribune review, 4 stars out of 4, with Hartwell calling the food a revelation of technique and heart, had changed everything. Reservations were booked 3 weeks in advance, culinary students requested stages in the kitchen, and Marcus's investors were discussing expansion rather than closure. David stood at the pass during the height of Friday evening service, watching his team execute the kind of precise, professional cooking that had become their signature. Luis commanded the sauté station with confidence that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Maria's knife work rivaled that of culinary school graduates. James and Carlos moved through their stations with the fluid efficiency of cooks who understood their craft at a fundamental level. "Order up," David called, sliding 4 perfectly plated dishes across the pass. Table 8, the tasting menu. The tasting menu had become Thompson's signature offering, a 5-course journey that showcased both classical technique and David's unique perspective on flavor combinations. What had started as a desperate gamble for Jonathan Hartwell had evolved into the restaurant's calling card, drawing food lovers from across the Midwest. Chef Jennifer, the server, approached the pass with a smile. Table 12 would like to send their compliments. They said the short ribs were the best they've had anywhere. David nodded his acknowledgement, but his attention was drawn to the dish pit, where a new employee worked with the same focused intensity he remembered from his own months in that position. Miguel, a recent immigrant from El Salvador, had been hired 2 weeks earlier. Like David before him, Miguel was overqualified for washing dishes, an engineering degree from Universidad Centroamericana that meant nothing in America without additional certification. "Miguel," David called during a brief lull in orders, "how are you settling in?" "Very well, Chef Karanja, thank you for the opportunity." David heard the formal politeness, the careful deferral that he remembered from his own early days. But he also noticed other things. The way Miguel's eyes tracked the kitchen operations, the subtle attention he paid to cooking techniques, the fact that his knife roll sat in his locker, despite his job requiring no cutting skills. "What's your background?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I worked in kitchens in San Salvador. Small places, nothing like this." The same careful modesty David had once practiced. "Would you be interested in learning some prep work? We could use help with vegetable cutting during slow periods." Miguel's face lit up with the kind of hope David remembered feeling when Marcus had first asked about his background. "Yes, chef, very much." "Luis," David called to his sous chef, "when you have time, show Miguel proper brunoise technique. Start him on the prep schedule Monday morning." It was a small gesture, but David remembered how life-changing such opportunities could be. The cycle was continuing, hidden talent being recognized, potential being unlocked, dreams being given room to grow. "Chef Karanja," a familiar voice caused David to look up from the menu he'd been reviewing. Janet Morrison stood at the kitchen's entrance, notebook in hand, but with a different energy than her first visit. "Ms. Morrison, good to see you again. Another review?" "Actually, I'm here about a feature story. Chicago Food and Wine wants to do a cover story on immigrant chefs transforming the city's dining scene. Your story would be the centerpiece, from dishwasher to one of the city's most celebrated chefs in under a year." David felt a flutter of the old anxiety. Success had brought visibility, and visibility always carried risks for someone whose immigration status remained complicated, despite Marcus's lawyer's best efforts. "I'm honored," David replied carefully, "but I'm not sure how interesting my story really is." "Are you kidding?" Janet's eyes sparked with enthusiasm. "David, you've created one of Chicago's most talked-about restaurants starting from the dish pit. You've proven that talent doesn't respect traditional career paths or nationality. That's exactly the kind of story people need to hear right now." Marcus appeared at David's shoulder, having overheard the conversation. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "But I think your story could inspire a lot of people who feel invisible in their current situations." David looked around his kitchen, truly his kitchen now, with his systems, his standards, his vision made manifest through the hard work of people who'd bought into something bigger than individual ambition. Miguel worked steadily at the dish station, probably dreaming the same dreams David had harbored months earlier. "Okay," David said finally. "Let's tell the story." The feature story ran 6 weeks later, with David on the cover of Chicago Food and Wine, wearing his chef's coat in his kitchen, surrounded by his team. The headline read, "From Invisible to Indispensable, How David Karanja Transformed Chicago Fine Dining." The response was overwhelming. Culinary schools invited him to speak. Other restaurateurs sought his advice on kitchen management. Immigration advocacy groups asked him to share his experience. Most importantly, he received dozens of letters from immigrant workers in kitchens across the country, thanking him for proving that talent could triumph over circumstance. But the moment that meant the most came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when David received a phone call from Nairobi. "David, is this really my son, the famous chef?" His mother's voice carried across continents and time zones, filled with pride that made his eyes water. "Hello, Mama. Yes, it's really me. I saw the article online. Mrs. Wanjiku showed me on her computer. My son on the cover of an American magazine." Her joy was infectious, making David smile despite his exhaustion from the previous night's service. I'm just cooking, Mama. The same thing I've always done. No, my son, you're showing the world that we belong anywhere we choose to work hard and dream big. That's much more than just cooking. After ending the call, David walked through his kitchen, noting the organized efficiency that had become second nature. The evening prep was underway, stock simmering, vegetables being cut with precision, sauces developing the complex flavors that would wow diners in a few hours. Miguel looked up from the prep station, where he was practicing his knife cuts. "Chef, I wanted to thank you again for the opportunity. I won't let you down." "You already haven't," David replied. "Just remember, talent doesn't stay hidden forever. Sometimes it just needs someone to believe in it." As the first dinner orders began printing, David took his position at the pass, ready to conduct another evening's symphony of flavors and techniques. The journey from dish pit to chef's position seemed impossible in retrospect, but standing here surrounded by his team, he understood that the most extraordinary transformations often began with the simple decision to stop hiding and start believing in yourself. The kitchen roared to life around him, and David Karanja, chef, mentor, and living proof that dreams deferred were not dreams denied, called out the first orders of another successful service. "Fire 2 salmon, 1 short rib, 1 duck breast. Let's show them what we can do."